Okay, thanks everyone for coming to my session this morning. My name's Ken Finnigan, and I'll be talking to you today about MicroProfile and in particular Thorntail, which is an implementation of Eclipse MicroProfile. So first off, we'll start with a bit of how things are going with Eclipse MicroProfile and where we're at today. So it's obviously microservice specifications for enterprise Java. We have about 10 or a dozen companies involved with Eclipse MicroProfile now, either as providing implementations or helping out with defining the specifications. And on the bottom left there, you can see the current status of which MicroProfile 2.1 was released a week and a half ago, roughly. And the current versions of the specifications there. So the blue ones at the base are the base Java EE specifications, and the I'm not sure whether that's an orange or a yellow, but whatever that color is, excuse me, defines all the specifications and the versions that Eclipse MicroProfile has developed to date. So it's an industry collaboration within the Eclipse Foundation. So how many of you here have actually heard of MicroProfile before now? Oh, that's a pretty good number. How many of you are actually using MicroProfile in your apps? Well, that's not too bad. So obviously, we're looking to have a rapid and predictable release cadence to solve some of the issues that Java EE has had in the past. So in terms of a timeline, obviously it was founded 2.5 years ago, roughly. And the first version that came out that year was simply a few Java EE specs, CDI, JXRS, JSON-P that were just bundled together. But then after that, we started adding some more interesting specs after we became part of the Eclipse Foundation. So we've had quite a few releases since then. I think we're at 7 now, roughly, with the next planned release being February next year. And in the last month, we recently agreed to change our kind of release cadence a little bit. The original goals were to try and have one a quarter. But we've kind of realized that that's a little bit too much, just in terms of the churn and everything that's required. And some of the process in Eclipse to get things released means that that's a little bit more difficult. So we're kind of switching to a 3 release a year, being the first of the month for February, June, and October. So some of that kind of aligns with sort of conference-driven development, particularly October being like Code 1, what was Java 1. And February and June kind of aligning with DevOxes and things like that. So now to talk about Thorntail, we have a logo finally, and I will have stickers at the end to hand out for those that are interested. So what is Thorntail? We used to be called Wildfly Swarm, and we changed the name for a number of reasons, some of the main ones being confusion around the likes of Docker Swarm, and confusion, strangely, with Wildfly itself as to whether we were a sub-project, how we related, what was used, and also moving away from the name Wildfly Swarm means that in the future we could do something that wasn't necessarily based on Wildfly, and then that wouldn't cause any confusion. So it's Red Hat's implementation of Eclipse MicroProfile, and currently we support MicroProfile 1.3, coming from Small Rye, and I'll get to Small Rye in a minute. So 2.2.1 final should be coming any day. I was saying coming this week, last week, and it still hasn't come yet. So hopefully in the next couple of days, that'll come out. And then in terms of a roadmap, we've recently shifted to a quarterly release cadence. And as part of the whole changing from Wildfly Swarm and changing the versioning scheme, we felt that the year-month day was cool and fun for a while, but it didn't really give it a good indication of the stability of various pieces and whether they were breaking changes. So that's why we've shifted back to the traditional semver kind of things. So 2.3.0 is the next major, well, minor release, but major release in terms of what we're doing, scheduled for around the end of the year. And that will include updates to Wildfly 14, so we'll bring along Java EE 8 specifications. And then obviously MicroProfile 2.0 is at a minimum, and quite likely 2.1. And as part of that, we'll see how we go. We might try and throw in some support for running on JDK 11. That kind of depends on how long the other pieces take and how much time we have before the end of the year. So what is Small Rye? So it also implements Eclipse MicroProfile specifications and currently supports MicroProfile 1.3. And it was created to extract some common elements out of Thorntail and allow other vendors within the Eclipse MicroProfile space to utilize these implementations so we could collaborate together. And I'll be going into a lot more detail on Small Ray at the one of the quickie sessions over lunch today. And at the moment it's utilized by obviously Thorntail, and as of Wildfly 14 there are 3 specifications: config, config, health check, and open API that Wildfly 14 includes from Small Ray. So now it's time for a bit of a demo. I'll be posting these slides and updating the demo later today, but the demo is available on my GitHub repo. So I have a very simple 2 servers here. The root POM just basically brings in the Thorntail BOM of 2.2.0, which is the latest version at present, and then defines the Maven plugin for Thorntail. And that's all that's in the root POM. So we have the greeting service POM, and all that does is say use the Thorntail plugin and use the MicroProfile dependency for Thorntail, which brings in every piece of the specification. So metrics, health check, open API, OpenTracing, it all gets bundled in there, and bringing that all into the application. So at the moment, I have a very simple JAX-RS resource class with a single method. Oops, that shouldn't be there yet. And all it does is return hello Voxxed. So that's not very interesting right now. So what we're going to do is add the ability to inject some configuration. Oops. And we'll give it a name of something like very original name, and we'll default it to something like nobody. And so I've just created a very simple configuration property there that'll pull in the value from the environment to set it, and then we can modify our statement over here to just simply make reference to that config property. So what I'll do now is quickly, hopefully, package that up into an Uber jar so that we can run it. And then we'll see what the simple UI I have. It's just a very basic HTML page to showcase a call to the backend service. So now starting up the Uber jar, which shouldn't take too long. And it's ready. So if we go over to here, so this is a very basic, I'll make that bigger. There we go. Very basic page just to invoke the endpoint I've created. So if I call invoke, you can see it's saying hello to nobody, which obviously doesn't really mean a whole lot. So what we can do is stop that and pass in a variable to have something more meaningful there. And so the way you can set that configuration is it can be through an environment variable, a system property, or you could use the MicroProfile config properties file, or you could even use the Thorntail project defaults YAML. So if we now invoke that, we're seeing it's now using hello Voxxed, and we didn't change any code, it's just picking up that configuration property. So that's kind of some basic stuff there. What I can show you as well is, without having to do anything else, I have a metrics endpoint already providing data in a Prometheus happy format. So by default, you get a whole bunch of what we call base, which is kind of like very system level metrics. And then down here, there should be some some vendor ones, sorry. And each vendor can add any number of specific metrics for their runtime to include in here. So you can see there's some like memory pool information in here. And at the moment, we don't have any application metrics showing. So what we'll do now is come back over here, and all I'll do is add an @timed, on here, which is one of the metrics annotations. So basically that's saying we want to time the requests and capture that across multiple calls and give us like average times and things like that. So just need to rebuild and start it up again. And there are many other annotations associated with metrics. There's a gauge, there's a counter. I'm not going to go through all of them. Feel free to read up on all the different kinds. And so now we're still getting hello Voxxed as we expect, but if we go over here and refresh, we should find, oh, it goes at the top. We should find we've got a whole bunch of application metrics there now showing like how many calls we've had, the time each call took. And if that's kind of a little verbose in terms of everything else going on, you can also go into the subdomain and just see the application metrics that you might have registered on your endpoints. You can also, on the endpoint here, specify, I won't do it, but you can specify different, basically display names, because by default, it's got the whole like package and class and method name in there. You can create simple names so it's easier for you to see and recognize what it is, which is very handy. So next on there is a health check. So once again, without having done anything, I have a health endpoint available, and obviously without any other, make that a bit bigger, without any other settings, it's just saying it's up, because I haven't defined any health checks myself. So what I can do is come over here and create a health check. And you can create any number of these that you want. So we just need to implement the health check response. Oh, hang on, what's going on there? No, that's not right. What have I done? Oh, this doesn't help that I can't remember which bits I need to implement. Health response, health check response. Is it a provider? I'll try that one. Okay. That's what happens when I haven't looked at this since last week. I forget what things need to be done. Sorry about that, but it is very easy to define your own health checks when you remember the right interface to implement. So if we move along now, and another thing to show here is that also without having done anything, we have an open API endpoint. Now granted, at the moment, there's not a whole lot there, but it gives you the basic endpoints that you've created from your JAX-RS resource classes without having to do any OpenAPI or Swagger annotations on your code. Now what you can also do is then start adding those annotations to provide more detail in there, so defining names, descriptions on your methods, the appropriate return types. You can go as detailed as you want in there, or you can just let it generate things for you. Okay, so now let's have a look at calling another service. So I've got another service up here called CuteName, which all it has is a simple service that uses an in-memory database to get some names and a whole bunch of adjectives to describe a person from in-memory as well. And it just basically returns a combined name that we can use. So to do that and use the REST client type safe, we'll create an interface. and we need to register that this is going to be a REST client interface. And then beyond that, it's simply a case of adding in whatever JAX-RS annotations you would have equivalent to on the server side. So we have an API endpoint that's the root, and we then add just the name. We say it's a get, and we need to say it produces, get one of the rows, text, and then it just returns a string. So essentially we've created what looks like a service endpoint within an interface in our calling side. So from that, the REST MicroProfile REST client can create a proxy that represents the server side and then call through to that without us having to worry about any HTTP code or anything like that. So after defining the interface, we can come back over here and I can do REST client builder dot new builder, and we need to give it the URL to where everything lives, which is just going to run on another port, and we need to tell it that we want to build the name service. Oh, I did this last time too. Put that in the wrong package. No wonder I can't find it. Okay, let's try that again. There we go. So we're just defining that we want to create a proxy using that interface, and then we can basically store that into a simple variable here, and then we can change this to get the name from that service. So that's a very simple way to use interfaces mapping onto external services. And as you can see, like, there's no HTTP network calls or anything like that that I need to worry about. That's all handled for the REST client for me. So if we repackage that, and while that's going on, I'll start up the Qt name service, and then we'll start the greeting service. Now, and if both of these work as expected, which is never guaranteed with demos, we should see when we come back over to here, we'll clear that, and if we invoke it, you can see we're getting a series of what you would call Qt names, but they're just silly names that are made up from combining different names and adjectives. So we're now calling that service with REST client. But obviously, if the Qt name service goes down and we try and invoke it again, we get a lovely 500 response code, which is not the best situation to be in. We want to handle that so that we don't have any problems and we can monitor when things are going wrong. So let's have a look over here. And what we can do for that is on the greeting here, we can just simply add a fallback and define the fallback method. And all we then need to do is actually create the method to provide the response. Now, one thing to note is when creating a fallback method, you need to return the same type of the method that you're falling back from. So as the greeting method here returns a JAX-RS response object, we also need to return the same thing from our greeting fallback. And we're just going to simply create a greeting entity with some basic information there. So now that we've done that, if we rebuild, and start it up again. Okay, we should be good to go. So now when we invoke that and the Qt name isn't there, we get the greeting fallback, and I can start this up again. Okay, so that's starting, so I can just keep hitting on this, and we should reach a point where that service is there, and you can see we've seamlessly gone from having no service active and seeing fallbacks to seeing the actual responses we want to see. So that's a pretty neat kind of fault-tolerant ability that we have in there with MicroProfile. So one of the next things I wanted to show is OpenTracing. So that's very important for seeing how things can flow through your system and to monitor how long each method or endpoint takes to respond to requests. And you might be able to find performance bottlenecks using something like that. So to do that, we're going to trace through both services. So we'll add a Jaeger implementation because MicroProfile comes with OpenTracing API integration, but to use that you need your own implementation. So for this I'm using Jaeger. And then we need to define the necessary settings to configure Jaeger so that when we're sending information into Jaeger, it's capturing the information we want. So in this case, I'm going to just say that we're using the Qt name service, and I'm going to start Docker all-in-one locally for that while I think of it. Okay, so that's starting up. So in the QName service, we've now got the Jaeger dependency and the Jaeger configuration to tell it what to do. So that's all we need to do for QName, and what I'll do is stop and repackage that. And while we're doing that, we'll start going through the greeting, because we need to do a similar kind of thing of adding the Jaeger dependency and also adding the configuration. So for that, it's going to be called greeting, and it's also going to hit the same Jaeger endpoint for reporting. So we'll package that. We'll start up the Qt name, and while that's starting, we'll go to the Jaeger UI just to see what's there right now. Make that a bit smaller. So right now there's like no services because there's no data that Jaeger has received, so it's a completely empty setup. So that is built. So we'll start that up. And we'll invoke this a few times just to show the different traces. So if we refresh Jaeger over here, we can now see we've got some services being logged in Jaeger. So we can see that the Qt name is being used, and we can see basically the single call to the endpoint there. And if we change that to the greeting service and look at those traces, we can see the greeting call there. But that's not really ideal because we're calling from one service to another, and as far as Jaeger is concerned, that doesn't look like what's happening. So what we want to do is modify the call from the greeting service to actually tell the trace, instantiate a tracer and get it to say we want to create a child span for when we're calling out. So to do that, we just inject a tracer from OpenTracing, and all we need to do then is register new client tracing feature and pass it that tracer. So all we're doing there is registering a provider that can handle the process of taking the span ID that's created in the greeting service and creating a child of relationship to anything that's called out from the REST client. So if we just quickly repackage that. And start that up again. So go back over to here, clear that. Yep, that's ready. So if we invoke that a few more times, and we come back over to here, and we refresh that, and then we search for greeting traces again, we can see we've now got spans that have got both services included, and we've got the nice cascading of a trace starting in greeting, goes down to the GET requests, and then calls out to get queue name. And you can see there the time the calls took to execute in each of those parts. So that's a really nice way of adding tracing through your system without having to have too much boilerplate in your code to define how things work. Okay. I think, trying to think of all the, I think that's most of what I had to demo there. So if we go back over here. So obviously I've recently written a book, and there are a few copies for those who couldn't pick them up last night that I'll sign, and there's a couple more for anyone who's interested afterwards, maybe after questions. So obviously there's some details on me, and if you want to get a hold of me to ask questions, then obviously there's Twitter or email or any way you can find me, basically. I'll do my best to help. And I think that's about it. That demo went a lot faster than I was expecting. Are there any questions that anyone has? Yes? So the question was around whether the REST client can be more reactive in the future. I presume you're meaning like whether it can do asynchronous and things like that? Yeah. There is currently work going on to support asynchronous, and I think it's there now. I think all it would require from memory is the interface that you define would need to have a return type of completable future instead of an actual type. And that would be enough to trigger the use of asynchronous behavior when calling out to another client. Yes? So the question is whether the proxy that's generated is thread safe. That very much depends on the implementation and what that does. Like for instance, I know there's implementations for this in REST-easy, which is what SmallRye uses, but there's also implementations in Apache CXF. I can't speak to CXF because I don't know the implementation code. From the REST-easy side, I believe that the interface, the proxy, is thread safe, but I also believe that it's not something that we're expecting to hang around like after you've completed the REST calls. So it would be like garbage collected once that method is called, and then using another client builder to create a new client. I haven't tried reusing the same client after it's created and making repeated calls. I'm not sure whether that has any kind of HTTP allocation issues and things not being shut down properly, but that's certainly something I should look into. Any other questions? Yes? For RAML, there aren't any current plans to add RAML support into MicroProfile, but if that's something that you would see is beneficial, then certainly come to the community threads and start a discussion around whether we could add RAML support. Yes? In terms of mutual TLS between services, there's nothing the Thorntail project is doing specifically, and I don't think there's anything from a Eclipse MicroProfile perspective to handle that. The current view, and we're researching this as part of the service mesh working group in Eclipse MicroProfile, is whether there's any issues in using like the mutual TLS of a service mesh, such as Istio. I've done plenty of examples of using mutual TLS with Istio, and it's, from my perspective, far easier just to hand that responsibility off to Istio and just have my services running in it than trying to do that something myself. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. So just so I heard it correctly, it's about integrations with Spring Boot, is that? Oh, okay. So it's whether MicroProfile or Thorntail is going to support some kind of auto configuration like Spring Boot does. I know for Thorntail we have some level of that for things like data sources and JDBC drivers, in that you can actually, I'll show you here for the QName service. I simply have a H2 database driver added as a dependency, and that will be enough for Thorntail to go away and create a JBoss module that maps to that dependency and then wire up the data source. So so for the configuration here, you can see there I've got a driver name of H2. That driver definition is auto-created for Thorntail. So I just know that if I add a dependency for H2, then I can simply refer to that driver name in my data source definition as H2. And there's a whole list of, let's see if I can find it, different data source definitions that we have out of the box. No, something like that doesn't exist in MicroProfile, for instance. This is something we've just done for Thorntail. So there's the list of current auto-detected drivers for Thorntail. So there's quite a reasonable list of ones there. So with those, you can simply add the JDBC driver onto your Maven dependencies, and then the name on the right is what you would use when you're defining your data source, and it gets linked up automatically for you. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much for your time this morning. And for those that are interested in a copy of the book, please come up. And for those that weren't here last night to get one, please come up and see me. Thank you very much.